Thank you everyone for coming on a Sunday afternoon right at lunchtime to listen to the Beyond Labels Evolving Data Classification talk. My name is Rob Oden. I am the Senior Data Classification Specialist on the Roblox Information Security team, and I'm going to be speaking, surprise, surprise, about data classification. And more than just speaking from like a consultant or here's what Gartner says you should do, I hope to integrate my last 20 years experience supporting the United States Air Force, multiple three-letter agencies within the intelligence community, consulting, aerospace and defense, and in my couple of last roles in tech, especially with what I'm doing here at Roblox. Now, a little bit about Roblox and why data classification is actually important to us. We have more than 72 million daily active users who use our platform. But we also have over 2.5 million developers who are creating amazing experiences. That's why we have over almost 4.5 million unique experiences. And as you can imagine, the types of data that we hold and the needs to protect that while at the same time sharing it appropriately is really critical and core to our business. So with that, we wanted to talk about, kind of share how to look at data classification. But I've found like when you dive right into a topic, it's really hard to contextualize it. So we want to kind of use like the McKinsey method, right? Of going very broad at first, that's the section 1, picking the right framework. And then the section 2 will deep dive into a framework that I recommend and believe is really impactful for creating an actual holistic data classification program. I will have a moment and I will read a question or two between 1 and 2 to give the digestion at that kind of broad level before we dive in. So going right in, picking the right framework. Now, I know with a bunch of security engineers, right, in a security conference, it wouldn't really be a security conference unless someone from GRC came and told you how important GRC is, right? Like, yes, we're a real place too, right? But as I see it, GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance, is how the InfoSec program, information security, cybersecurity, communicates to the rest of the business as well as to the rest of the world, from our regulators to our users, right? It drives our program. GRC is not a monolithic, it is 3 components. Your governance, from how should we do security, to risk management, understanding the operational drivers of our business and those things challenging us from accomplishing those goals and right-sizing our approach to those risks. And finally, compliance, understanding the regulatory and industry, whether PCI DSS or GDPR, and what's the appropriate level of compliance that your organization needs to meet. Now, not all GRC programs are the same, right? Usually there is a primary driver. And from that primary driver, you can see what kind of information security program you have. And so what I call these is the big letter. So first we start off with the big G GRC program, a governance-led security best practice. This is very common in the US, right? If you see a security program, we have firewalls, we have a DART. This is the things that we should do for security. What we've been seeing growing, especially with the changes into the SEC announcement, as businesses have been trying to quantify and qualify the security risk in a more financial terms, now you've been seeing big R GRC programs from a risk management, my right-sizing security. And then finally, you usually see this in either heavily regulated industries within the US, or you see this a lot in European agencies, a compliance, a big C, right? So it's like you must do these things for ISO 27001, or GDPR, or your NIST 853 if you're a US government agency. At Roblox, we leverage the big R GRC program. So we look at to our business partners, the board, from our hiring, from the tools we spend, are we approaching the right problems, and are we appropriately dedicating not only the people, resources, and time towards those things? Now, why am I talking about GRC when we talked about data classification? Well, you can have that same perspective from data classification to the GRC. So let's first start off with the things that we're most common with, the big G, right? From a governance-led, if you put how do I do data classification in ChatGPT, this is what you're gonna get. Or maybe a consultant says, here's the things you should do, right? They're gonna tell you to identify your data, to classify it, put some protections around it, educate your team members, and then do monitoring. And I'm not gonna talk about that. There's a lot of materials on there. if you're interested, NIST is actually trying to codify all of this for those best practices and their data classification. But we're not going to focus on that, right? Nor are we going to focus on the compliance, right? There's organizations that already have very detailed, whether you're a PCI DSS for your 16-digit PANs in your cardholder data environment, or your user PII very explicit, or your ISO 27001 using 27002 controls, right? It'll be very specific to very specific data types. And you see this a lot for departments or teams that hold that data, but it doesn't really expand out. And from that, you don't have to determine your data. You just classify what you're already told to protect. You put the protections. You have to show compliance to an outside organization. And then you're constantly doing plans of action and milestones to show that you're constantly meeting that. And we're not going to go into that because I do think that is important to know, but that is a component of the program, especially when you're looking at it from the enterprise. Instead, how we approach this, again, at Roblox, we're a big R cybersecurity program. Break it out into a little bit simpler. Scope, defining why you are actually trying to classify data, right? What is your drivers? Who's your actual stakeholders? What's the impact you're trying to get to? They stratify. How do I prioritize, classify, categorize, segment? What's more important in one situation or another, right? How do I understand that, not just from where I stand, but from my partners? And then finally, the secure. Am I putting in the appropriate measures for my organization, right? Am I right-sizing security based off of the sensitivity of the data and the impact to my operations? Now, like I said, this is the broad focus on here. We looked at GRC and we looked at the different frameworks. One of the things from the feedback is just kind of a chewing on that. Do we want to see if there's a question that I can answer, or we can dive in? If there's any in the QA? Not yet. Perfect. Cool. Okay, great. And the first question, sometimes GRC has to interface with enterprise or financial GRC teams. How do you effectively communicate security and privacy priorities to those stakeholders? One is to understand, so that's great. So every single team is going to have their own priorities, whether you're talking about engineering, whether you're talking about legal privacy, whether you're talking about an internal department. You have to understand that they do have that priority, and for them, that is their burning platform. But you also have to understand and communicate what does the organization as a whole is facing, right? So maybe for you as an individual or for the company, it's not a P0, right? The priority might be a little bit slowing, but you have to ensure that they know that in your road mapping, in your prioritization, and in your communication plans, you are taking into account their main drivers, and they have that assurance that that is actually being addressed. That's how I feel like from there. Great. So with that, we go broad. Now let's go drill in. With the scope, stratify, and secure. Now, I have this in a linear path, but I want in the back of your mind is that you usually will start with scope first, but you're going to kind of do some of these in parallel and somewhat circular. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So first and foremost, like all things, asking the right questions, right? Driving. And this comes into, why are you doing this in the first place? I had one person says, I thought I was protecting this, and then my CEO said, this is the most important. We've had conversations. I know what my CEO thinks is the most important, but I also know some of the directors and VPs very disagree about what's important. What is our sensitive data? What can break our business, right? So asking the questions, it's really easy to start. I think I already know the answer, but taking a moment, doing that due diligence, looking at it from multiple perspectives, kind of showing like, why am I doing this in the first place? Which kind of leans into some of the common issues that I have faced in my career. First and foremost, what is your burning platform? I think this seems simple, but I promise you, not only is this something you should be asking at the beginning, but you should be asking continuously, because as you evolve, as you grow, as you drive to solutioning, you can sometimes lose track of this. So understanding what is the operational need your organization is trying to solve with the ability to categorize and classify your sensitive information. There is the leveraging, next is the leveraging what already exists. Crown jewels and data classification is not a circle, but it is a Venn, right? You might have conflicting priorities, or they might be really aligned. Sometimes when we get brought in, says we need to relook at how we're classifying data, and it's really easy to throw the baby in the bathwater. But you can leverage components, you can leverage pieces of it. Again, if you have a department such as your payments, you might do PCI DSS because they maintain a CDE or maintains parts of it. There's really good things you can take from that. You don't have to be directed or limited by it, but it's really good to take that. The thing that I have found the most impactful is understanding that we all have unconscious discipline biases, and you stand where you sit. How you prioritize something is usually going to be based off of the role and the priorities that you have. Understand that legal might have very different ones. Compliance might have very different. They will have different. They're going to be very opinionated. And you're going to first, when you approach this, if you approach this as a security professional, that might not be right size for the organization because the operational need of that. So just take into account your own biases, taking in these other perspectives, and really trying to drive to, again, why we recommend from the risk, what's actually having the impact to get to the business operations while reducing the risk to do so. And then finally, something that I have struggled, especially moving from like government to aerospace and defense to tech. Tech moves really quick, really fast. I don't like putting subpar. I'm very proud of my work. I'm surrounded by people who I learn from every day at Roblox. So I want that perfect product, but you're never gonna have perfect. And you can have analysis paralysis with this problem. So having something good enough that you have the drive and being able to just land something, push it forward. And with that, also understanding you're not alone, right? And something I've heard really good is like the democratization of vulnerability management, making owners, pushing it down. If security becomes the owner of the rest of the organizations, we have failed. Same thing with data classification. Make them responsible. Have your business partners of saying, how do you define what's sensitive in your organization? Why is it? What's the operation, right? Bringing other people in. And the more people in, again, from there, you can really drive your impact. So kind of now that we've kind of scoped out the problem, how do we actually define, categorize, segment, prioritize, all that, right? Now, a fun little thing about these slides, every image in here was generated by ChatGPT. These are not Roblox images. These were things I told it to do, either ChatGPT or some other thing. So with that, spelling is still a work in progress. So you're gonna see a lot of misspelling in here, but we're dealing with AI. The most common that you have from a data categorization is the industry standard, right? Your 4 levels. Your public, your internal, your confidential, your restricted. They might use the words a little bit different. You might go 3, you might go 5. But the idea is how do you bucketize your information to set a minimum level of protection, and so the entire enterprise understands, if it's this, I do this with it. Well, the problem with that is that's very broad and doesn't really meet a lot of use cases, right? So then we go in something like this, where we're being very specific, right? How I actually identify for PII, for example, someone's email versus someone's social security number, I'm gonna be handling very different. Maybe I have their gameplay and I don't have any direct identifiers. How do I mark that? How do I identify? That is gonna be something that you're going to have to work through, but with the understanding that you can, just like I mentioned with the McKinsey, right? You go wide, then you go deep. It's the same thing with data classification. Understand a common lexicon of how you define what sensitive data is for the enterprise, but also understanding when you need to go drill in, do you have the capability and that those can marry? Because there is rarely a department that only has data for its department. You're gonna have to share either externally to the organization or externally to different departments. And so you're gonna need to know how to handle that data. So right sizing what that classification is going to be a significant effort. And again, you're not gonna be perfect. So having something that works and you can ship and then constantly iterate on is much more impactful than trying to figure out the perfect solution. And again, just like we did with scoping, there are some common issues. Thinking past the initial needs, this was a thing that we ran into when I was at Facebook or Meta. Because I don't know, maybe some of you heard in 2016, we had a little bit of a hiccup with how we were doing user privacy. And so we had FTC, we had a big compliance fix, privacy. And so how we looked at data classification was from a privacy standpoint. Well, the problem is if you go and you build your entire program based off of one specific department's need, when you look to expand that to the enterprise, your guidance, your direction, your handling is going to have that bent. And things where it would be a little bit more easier to kind of move, you're really going to be restricted. So having in the mind, again, what is the operational need that you are trying to meet as your organization? You're trying to buy down the risk. Having that in the back of your mind, what's that burning platform, while accounting for these departmental needs to be really granular, be really protective. Sometimes that's supplemental guidance. We can talk about that in the secure section, but really keeping that in mind. Again, if this was a college lecture, this would be my foot stomp moment. Leverage what you exist. The reason I mentioned this twice is because I have done this wrong so many times. Because a lot of us come into a new role and we want to show how smart we are. We want to show how we are the ones who are producing the great things. And so we'll come in and be like, great ideas. Well, there's a lot of things, even if you have a program that says, look, we didn't do data classification right, there's always something that can work. And there's a lot of frameworks out there. Don't be constrained by the frameworks, but leverage them, leverage the language, leverage the lexicon. You can be really impactful from this, but also understand that some people are so tied to those lexicons, tied to those frameworks, that there might be a little bit of massaging of how you communicated this. Focus on the enterprise, not the team. Again, whatever you do is going to have to be not, even if it's like, let's say credit card information or payment information. Rarely, if ever, is it just the payment information. It might be customer service or support. That's going to be transferring on your organization. It has to be able to communicate. And then finally, something that we do here at Roblox that I think is really good, if there is no action, there is no category. Why would I put a label on a piece of data if I don't want people to do something specific with that category, that they're not doing something specific with another? And as security professionals, we fall into this trap, right? Because we want contextualized data. Security is about context. So if I can get more context about who, what, when, and where at the data level, yay. But the problem is from a usability, from adoptability, from actual enhancement, this is going to impact you. And we had this at L3 Harris, where our first data category was 48 different categories of data. As you can imagine, wasn't well received. Security loved it. Our engineering operation didn't. So then we went down to 6, right? So you have to right size that. But there's something else, is semantics are actually important in this world. What you call something. So if you're in an organization, let's say you're in a US government lint, even using the words confidential, secret, top secret are no-goes, because those are US government classifications. And if you have an organization that holds classified data, they're not wanting to see that on your corporate or your prod that you have confidential or secret information. Understanding the industry for the languages, the word sensitive, from a data classification and a data protection and data security, sensitive means that this data is more important than this other one from an impact standpoint. But privacy has adopted the language of sensitive, and they think sensitive only means sensitive PII, right? Even though that they took sensitive from the industry standard to say this is PII that is more important than the rest of PII. So understand that how you describe the language, the terminology might ruffle some feathers, might have different views. So getting to that, right? This is a fun little exercise when you start saying this is here, your prioritization, this is more important than this, understanding that people might get tripped up on words. And so with that in the back of your mind, say, okay, cool, now let's roll back to actually, maybe there's a different word I can use, or let's set a definition internally from a taxonomy. Okay, great. Now I've told you we're going to scope it, kind of break it out. Now let's actually do what we actually care about, right? Securing. Well, a lot of what we were talking about was a taxonomy, how we describe something and why we describe it. And most people, they think, hey, let's label it. Either a metadata tag, which is machine readable. Maybe it's a marking, right? Attorney-client privilege, header, footer. If you're doing export control, your control numbers, whatever, right? I want a human being to know and do something. Or maybe it's an index, meaning that I have a database that says, in this data store, this database, these columns are these data types, and I can call from identification. Great, I'm done. No, because you're not actually getting any security from that. You have awareness, but I worked for this lawyer who said you never want to go from ignorance to negligence overnight. So you just tagging and saying, hey, I have data, it's not being protected, great, now you have compliance fines. You actually need to protect the data. And data classification in and of itself is an enablement, right? Again, we've been talking about risk and right sizing. This allows us to say, where do we prioritize our funding and our resources? And so starting with the thing that most people think about for data security, and that is access management. We've had some phenomenal talks about right sizing, who should access data. This is an amazing resource to say, this repository or this service access this level of sensitive data. Maybe we should be a little bit more restrictive. Or in the inverse, which I think is really good, hey, we have 80% of our data that has just internal data. Maybe we default the access to those repositories that if you ask for it, you get it, right? We make it really simple and really easy. Next is your data tagging discovery, especially if you have compliance regulations or if you say you have sensitive data types that can possibly bleed over into other parts. PCI is a good example. They always want you to look. If you hold any credit card information, they want you to look for credit card information. This allows you to not only just rely on your people, but use technology to start searching for this. That goes into your data loss prevention. Data loss prevention is a transportation control, right? I am moving data either outside an authorized storage, moving to external parties, I'm moving to external teams. Can I control with that, right? If you know what your data is, or even if you're doing content inspection, like you're inspecting the data as it's moving, you need to know what that data should be and why it's categorized that way. Next is policy enforcement, right? Where we go and say, the direction I've given you should do this. And then obviously for data security, our second favorite control is encryption, right? Whether that's full disk encryption for your authorized storage, whether it's file-based encryption, whether you're IRM, DRM, or whether it's your application level encryption from like your databases where there's specific data types, right? This allows us, where do I put this very high intense resource, right? There's a cost to implying encryption. Now I'm right sizing it. And then finally, you have the audit of that, because there's a lot of people saying, hey, we've done this. How do we prove that we've actually done this? And do I have the tools and capability that I can go and say, is my tools effective? And I'm answering that question. And why this, and the thing that's in the center, I cannot expect people to do stuff if I do not tell them to do it and how to do it, right? A big thing that I got complaint when I was at Booz Allen is we would tell people what to do, not how to do it or in which situations to do it, right? We're like, great, I'll come back in 6 months and tell you the same advice. But from that is being like, they need to have actionable results. And with that, comes into kind of your phases, right? A lot of people, especially as we are looking at staff reductions, efficiencies, we all want to go to automation. But if SOAR, Security Orchestration Automated Response, has taught us anything, right? SOAR made a lot of promises that it hasn't really delivered. But you know what it did do? It forced a lot of teams to actually write down what the processes should be. Right, that orchestration has been pivotal. And this is what I say for data classification. First and foremost, if you want people to do something, write it down, make it guidance, make it available, make it easily understandable. Then you can tie in manual controls about what you wrote down. That should tie into, if there's a change, there's a modification, you write it down. And then finally, once we start seeing activities and behaviors that we expect to be certain way, then we can start automating to relieve the load. We can abstract some of this from our engineers, from our users, from our teams. We can make it easier. And then we reinforce that with guidance and manual control so we can right size. But all this to being said, let's say you're due. Let's say tomorrow, boom, you're successful, data classification's in place. But just like access management, just like key management, just like certificate management, it's the management that's the hard part. The initial rolling out is easy, for the most part. Your uniqueness, your situations, your regulatory environment's changing, how you prioritize data. Maybe you've gotten the low-hanging fruits and now you need to really dig into your business processes, right? That is going to be an ongoing effort. And this goes back to the conversation I pointed at the beginning. Your risk management approach. What's important to the business, not what's important to cybersecurity, right? Because we would all prefer people to do the most secure, but it causes a lot of friction. We really need to go with what we are trying to do. At Roblox, we are wanting to build to 1 billion users. That is our that is our goal. We want to connect 1 billion users for unique experiences. If I'm causing friction in that growth, right, I'm going to stop us from doing that. But if I don't protect our reputation, do the data stewardship and the trust that our users and our creators have given us for their sensitive data, then we're not going to do the 1 billion users, right? So it's that right balance from there. And so that management, that interaction is really key. And then with this, tying it all together, the main key points I hope everyone's able to walk away from is every organization is going to have a different business and regulatory needs, and your data classification should reflect that. Meaning you should be able to frame It should reflect your business. Your business shouldn't try to modify to your classification program, which is something that I've fallen into that trap, right? Here's how you do data classification. We should build it. It should be diverse. Ensure you have a clear roadmap because you're going to be challenged. You're going to have new situations. Where are you going and why? What is that story, right? If that story is not aligned with the business, if that story is not aligned with where the organization is going, you're going to divert, you're going to focus on the wrong things, and you're not going to get the buy-in you need from key partners. Taking a holistic approach to right-size your classification strategy accordingly, right? Sometimes you're going to be a little bit smaller just so you can get impact and roll with it, and you add and you add and add. You're making sure that are we prioritizing security in the right way, not just because this is what we should do. And finally, just like security by design, privacy by design, shift left, the more that you can integrate your data classification, how we identify, why we identify, and how we're prioritizing data at the earliest, from controls, from even collection of data, is the more impactful that we can be as a program as a whole. And then with that, I want to thank everyone for your time. And then we are going to go to questions. But with that, find me on LinkedIn, find me on Roblox, and we are hiring from a number of positions. So if you are looking for a role, please come to our Roblox shops. Okay. Yep. Okay, I'll be reading off the questions now. Obviously, thank you everyone who attended so far. Do you see value in decision trees to help people make decisions on which data is classified where? Absolutely, right? My intent is to default into what makes the adoption the simplest. Because if your average user, your average person is able to incorporate this, now the problem is how do you make that decision tree, right? Do you make it very broad and go in? And you're gonna have to tailor this based off the type of data. So let's take PII, for example. If you're doing a decision trees, you're gonna have to have supporting documentations for that and to kind of streamline people with the idea that you have very clear definitions of what the categories are, as well as what the expected protections is for that. So yeah, I think decision trees are great. How do you handle people who don't want to take ownership of their data? This is a spicy one because we are struggling with this right now. Because define me an owner. Is it a service owner? Is it a system owner? Is it a process? Is it data? Right? So for us, we are working with the data ownership and data steward because responsibility is kind of okay, accountability is a real struggle. So that we are working with our senior leadership, we're working with our key XFN partners and say this type of data should be owned by this group. And we're looking to default that at the VP level, at the pillar level. Great, no one in your team wants to own this, you own this now. Ooh, no, this shouldn't be me. How do I push that down? Again, pushing that decision, pushing that integration to the business, saying, look, we are trying to right-size security for business operations, but that means that when you were saying you were accepting a risk, you were taking ownership of that. And certain risks you can accept at your levels, other risks you can't. So it's that communication. Hopefully I've answered that question. Next, do you see value in decision trees to help? Okay, we already did that. How do you align the business risk tolerance with employee incentives? This one's a fun one. I would see employee incentives not from like stock or compensation, but from I'm gonna make your job easier. So I'm a big fan of the golden path, if you're familiar with that. Like the thing I want you to do, I make that easy. And the thing I don't want you to do, I make that hard. And I should be meeting 80 to 90% of your stuff on the easy path. And the hard path, we're gonna do exception process and you have to really justify, and we go up to a level, not just your manager, but a little bit higher for that exception, right? If we're gonna go outside the bounds, there's a reason why. So sometimes GRC has to interface, I already got that one. And what metrics is there for measuring program management over time? This one I would see is, hit me up after this one, because this one I probably spend a lot more time on than I should. You had mentioned having an appropriate roadmap for the journey. What's the biggest challenge putting together a roadmap? That the priorities are going to change in your organization. right? A lot of times people say, hey, here's our H1, here's our H2. I've had 3 different views on what data classification should be in my last 18 months here at Roblox, right? And sometimes those priorities change. I think the biggest thing is like what we're trying to drive and to achieve. And then there's just the unknown unknowns that show, like I'm starting to go down someplace and you agree me from this pillar and this pillar. And now let's say creator says, actually, this completely contradicts, or I need X, Y, and Z. And that can significantly change your roadmap, how you prioritize, and which initiatives that you push forward. And I think I got a question for one more. Can you walk through a sample data tag? Can someone hit me up after that one? I'd love to walk that, but that's going to take a little bit more. And is there a relationship between a data size and classification type? I personally, it's really easy to go and say something, based off the petabyte and zettabyte. I think it should be the data type first, and then you can see the size of it. Right? Because like say from a data exfiltration, if you look at, we have this gigabytes left out, but it's mostly your public and internal, but you have a couple megabytes that's your most restricted, that's what I care about more. So first start with the data type and the sensitivity, then the size comes into play, and that's where I go. And with that, I'm over time. Thank you everyone for your time.